Next speaker is Professor Brett Murphy, who has many fine attributes. A modeler and ecologist of small animals, and he's had a great challenge in trying to assemble all these data for this epic analysis. I'd just like to point out one thing, that $1 Australian is about 70 US cents when everyone's been mentioning dollars.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time. Sorry, I'm going to be talking about this, this work that I've been involved with for several years now, but working with this sort of big group of people. It's been very much a team effort. And some of these people have been involved with the data collection that sort of has underpinned this work for, I think, 25 years, since the early 90s. And even in addition to these people, there's many more people that have been involved in the data collection, rangers and volunteers and whatnot. So I'm going to be talking about this work that's really tried to address this question of whether fire management can be expected to increase tree biomass in Australian savannas. I'm sure you all sort of know about fire management in Northern Australia after the last few days. I guess all I'll say is that really there's been a transformation in the way that fire is managed in Northern Australia over the last couple of decades, and it's really been driven by the carbon economy. We've seen a really widespread replacement of extensive high intensity late dry season fires with lower intensity early dry season fires, and it's really been to a large extent because of the proliferation of these carbon projects. You can see they cover an enormous area in Northern Australia, 421,000 square kilometres, a huge area. It's about 70% of the high rainfall tropical savannas, so the areas above 1,000 millimetres of mean annual rainfall. And these projects really work by like I said, reducing typical fire intensities and frequencies so that less fuel is burnt each year. And this either results in fewer emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, which are potent greenhouse gases, or allows more fuel to accumulate and results in more carbon being stored in fuel. But primarily it's that the first one, the abatement of those greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, that these projects run on. And so they've had a really dramatic effect in changing fire regimes. I can't actually see that now. I can't remember the numbers. How do I move that, Andrew? Oh, there we go. So if we, as an example, if we look at the Walfer project, which was really the first, well, it was the first carbon project in, I think, 2005-ish. And so they've seen a reduction in fire frequencies over that time, about a 20% reduction in fire frequencies and about a 53% reduction in the frequency of high intensity fires. So a really big change in fire regimes. But that sort of pattern is really borne out right the way across Northern Australia. I can't make it move. Oh, sorry, I think it's just the picture's maybe too big. Yeah. So I guess these shifts in fire regimes really beg the question of how these changes in fire regimes might be affecting, ecological factors such as the abundance of trees and other habitat attributes. We certainly know that fire regimes strongly affect savanna tree populations. There's a really well-known study at a place called Solar Village near Darwin that showed really big changes in tree populations after 23 years of fire exclusion. So you can see that top photo is pretty much annually burnt. And then this is the fire excluded site. And you can see that tree covers increased, tree densities increased, and pretty much all the grasses have been lost. So potentially you can see these big shifts in the composition of the tree community. Also, we know that high intensity fires can really strongly affect tree populations. This is some work of Andrew Edwards and others. They showed that there were these, they sort of focused on these really high intensity fires at a few different locations in the top end, and showed these really enormous rates of trees being killed by the fires. So between about a quarter and half of trees were killed by these very high intensity fires. So clearly fire regimes can affect tree populations. But I guess these are essentially extremes of fire regimes, so complete fire exclusion or these extremely high intensity fires. But the sort of shifts in fire regimes that we've seen in response to fire management are a bit more nuanced. So it can be a bit trickier to kind of figure out what the long-term effects of those will be. And so I guess over a number of years, we've sort of tried a few different approaches to get at this question of how tree abundance responds to fire management. And I guess we've sort of ended up settling on an approach using a demographic model. So it's sort of an individual-based model of a savanna tree population, where we explicitly focus on these three demographic processes. So recruitment of new trees, growth of existing trees, and mortality or death of trees. And so those processes interact to sort of control the structure and the structure of the tree population and the abundance of trees. And so we've built this model that takes account of climate, as well as soils, and critically it takes account of fire to understand how these fire affecting these demographic processes affect the tree population. And so the model itself is really underpinned by a very data-rich model. It's sort of underpinned by a huge data set that's been collected over 25 years in Northern Australia. You can see these sites where all the each one of these crosses is a long-term vegetation and fire monitoring site. There's 450 plots across quite a dramatic rainfall gradient. You can see down to about 600 millimetres up to about 1500 millimetres. So the high rainfall plots were monitored for about almost 25 years. The low rainfall plots were a shorter period, about 13 years. And at each of these plots, there's annual observations of fire, so whether the plot was burnt or not, and an estimate of the intensity of the fire. And in these monitoring plots, individual trees were permanently tagged. So there were about 12,000 tagged trees. And in the data set over this time period, there's more than 70,000 individual DBH measurements. So it's a really enormous data set that we could use, that we could analyse to build this model, essentially. And so I'll just very quickly touch on the results of that analysis of that data set. Basically, it showed that fire really strongly affects these three demographic processes. Basically, more fires and more intense fires reduce recruitment rates of trees, they reduce growth rates of trees, and they increase the mortality of trees. So exactly as you'd expect. I'll just touch on these very, very quickly. In the case of recruitment, you can see that recruitment rates on the y-axis, so just in trees per hectare per year, declined as you get a greater number of high intensity fires in the monitoring period. So this is growth. You can see that as the frequency on the x-axis of low intensity fires increases, there's a slight reduction in dBH increments, so the sort of how much diameter increases each year. And with increasing frequency of moderate intensity fires, you see a sort of much more pronounced negative effect on tree growth. And then in the case of high intensity fires, this very severe reduction in tree growth as the frequency of high intensity fires increases. This is mortality, and you can see there's a sort of really well documented in previous papers, this sort of U-shaped relationship between mortality and dBH. So you have high rates of mortality in the smaller stems and the larger stems, and the sort of medium-sized stems are the ones that are more likely to survive. But again, we saw this very clear fire effect where increasing intensity of fires resulted in much higher rates of mortality of trees. So exactly as we'd expect from previous work. But I guess the good thing about analysing all this data is that it gave us the ability to really clearly parameterize this model. So we sort of had we knew we had a good idea of the sorts of patterns we were going to see, but it gave us the ability to really clearly and confidently parameterize this demographic model. But it allowed us to ask these questions. To what extent is tree abundance suppressed by ambient fire regimes? And if the style of fire management that we're seeing across Northern Australia, is that likely to lead to long-term increases in tree abundance? And so our demographic model, running it for the simulation for 1,000 years, and repeating it 1,000 times, and taking the median value is what the blue line represents, and doing this for woodland, the woodland vegetation class, which is the most sort of widespread major vegetation class in Northern Australia. You can see that in the case of low intensity fires, as frequency increases, tree biomass decreases slightly, not a huge amount. As moderate intensity fires increase in frequency, there's a bigger reduction. And you can see that in the case of high intensity fires, as frequency increases, there's a really massive reduction in tree biomass. But that said, the frequency of these fires in our data set were actually relatively low, especially in the case of high intensity and moderate intensity fires. So these little circles here indicate the actual frequencies in our data set. And so the actual reduction in biomass due to fire is relatively modest, is the prediction of the model. So the model predicts that ambient fire regimes are suppressing tree biomass by about 32% relative to if there was a situation with no fire. The next thing we did was simulated a plausible change in fire management, and to sort of get an idea of what's a plausible change in fire management, we looked to the Walfer example and used the reduction in fire frequency and the reduction in frequency of moderate and high intensity fires that have been observed there, and applied that to the simulation model and looked at how tree biomass would respond. And you can see that over time, over several centuries, there's a significant increase in tree biomass in response to that management. In just 100 years, there's about an 11% increase in tree biomass under this management regime, or about 11 tonnes of biomass per hectare. And I guess while that doesn't sound like a lot, it's equivalent to a carbon credit of about 0.2 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And if we assume a carbon price of $21 US, which I think was the average on the Australian carbon market over the last couple of years, that's how I got that figure. It's about $4.20 per hectare per year. So quite a relatively small sum for a hectare, but it scales up to really enormous values. And especially if we compare it to the sorts of abatement that are generated in these existing carbon projects, it's several times larger. Potentially if you were to sell these carbon credits due to sequestration into biomass, it would be several times larger than the abatement of methane and nitrous oxide. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to just skip over this. Basically, yeah. So while tree biomass in Australian savannas is relatively stable, even these small changes that we expect to see really do add up to significant sums when applied at sort of large spatial scales.